December 14th, 1943, near Smolensk, western Russia. The cold cut like a knife through the black pines that lined the railway. The air shimmered with frost and the horizon was a haze of smoke and distant thunder. A lone steam locomotive, its paint scabbed by soot and shrapnel, groaned to a halt in the snow. The hiss of venting steam echoed like a dying breath. Major General Hans von Vormann of the 9th Army stood beside the tracks, his breath clouding in the frigid air, his fur-lined collar stiff with ice. He waited for the train that would never come. Behind him, the remnants of a Panzer Grenadier battalion huddled around dying campfires. Their boots cracked with frost. The last ration tins were already empty. The field kitchens had nothing left to boil but snow. The men glanced toward the railway line, their only lifeline, and saw nothing but empty rails stretching westward, swallowed by white fog and fear. Vormann's aide, Lieutenant Kramer, approached, his face gaunt. "Sir, the quartermaster reports no fuel, no ammunition, and no bread. The supply train from Orsha has not arrived. 3 days overdue." Vormann said nothing. He turned his eyes toward the east, where the dull thud of artillery rolled like distant thunder. Soviet guns again, always closer, always more. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The railways had once been the arteries of the Wehrmacht, iron veins pumping supplies from the Reich's heart to the farthest tip of its conquest. Each line was a masterpiece of German precision, captured Soviet gauges converted, junctions rebuilt under the supervision of the organization Tod, every schedule timed to the minute. In 1941, these rails carried the promise of victory. Now in 1943, they carried only ghosts. A whistle shrieked down the line, distant, lonely. The men stirred, heads turning hopefully. But it was not a train. Vormann raised his binoculars. Through the falling snow, a black column moved along the horizon. Not carriages, tanks, T-34s, their turrets dusted white, gliding like beasts across the frozen steppe. "God help us," Kramer muttered. The general lowered the glasses slowly. He knew what it meant. The Soviet winter counteroffensive had severed the Smolensk-Vyazma rail line 2 days ago. The 9th Army was now trapped in a frozen pocket, its lifeline cut by the Red Army's relentless advance. No fuel meant no retreat. No ammunition meant no defense. The order from Army Group Center had been simple: hold the line at all costs. But Vormann understood the cruel arithmetic of war. Without supply, there was no line to hold. He turned back toward the men, his soldiers, his responsibility, and for the first time in months, he saw fear unmasked. Not the fear of death, but of abandonment. The kind of dread that came when the train stopped coming. In the silence, he heard it, the faint creak of the tracks settling in the cold, the sound of iron contracting, groaning like the very bones of the Reich freezing in place. "Prepare fallback positions," Vormann said quietly, "and burn the records." "We move by night." Kramer hesitated. "Without orders?" The general's eyes hardened. "There will be no orders. Berlin doesn't hear us anymore." Somewhere deep in the forest, the rumble of engines began again, distant, relentless. The Red Army's vanguard was already advancing. Vormann looked once more at the rails disappearing westward into the snow, and for the first time, he realized the truth. The Eastern Front wasn't collapsing in battle, it was starving to death. As night fell, the men dismantled what remained of their camp. Fires were extinguished, maps were folded and burned. The general watched as the last ember died, leaving only the cold and the dark. Then, like a shadow, the 9th Army began to move quietly, desperately, away from the dead rails that had once promised salvation. The snow fell thicker now, muffling every sound but one, the groan of distant iron, the whisper of something immense unraveling in the east. December 16th, 1943. The rail junction at Orsha. The once bustling yard lay silent beneath a thin veil of smoke. Freight cars stood frozen on the tracks, half buried in snow, their contents looted or abandoned. Black crows perched on the twisted telegraph wires, their wings silhouetted against the dim iron-gray sky. Here at Orsha, the German Army's lifeline had finally snapped. Colonel Wilhelm Henschel of the Transportation Corps trudged through the wreckage, his boots crunching on shattered glass and spilled grain. He had overseen this junction for 2 years, an intersection where trains from Minsk, Smolensk, and Vitebsk met before crawling toward the front. Now the switching levers were jammed with ice, the semaphore lights shattered by shellfire, and the men who once kept the timetable running had fled or been buried beneath the snow. A destroyed locomotive lay on its side beside the main platform, its tender ruptured by a bomb strike. The blackened boiler had cooled days ago, the smell of burnt coal still thick in the air. "Get those cars off the main line," Henschel shouted, his voice rasping from exhaustion. "If we can clear even one track—" "Sir," a corporal interrupted, clutching a frostbitten hand to his chest. "There's nothing left to move them with. No engines, no crews. The Soviets shelled the depot last night. We lost everything." Henschel looked toward the western horizon. A thin column of retreating German infantry moved along the road, their trucks sputtering from lack of fuel. The colonel felt a knot tighten in his chest. The army had forgotten that war depended on rails as much as rifles. He crouched beside the twisted remains of a signal relay box and pried open the metal lid. Inside, the copper wiring had been cut, sabotaged no doubt by partisans before the retreat. The Soviet advance wasn't just smashing through the front lines. It was suffocating the Wehrmacht's arteries bit by bit, bridge by bridge, junction by junction. A telegraph operator approached, his face ghostly pale. "Herr Oberst, message from Army Group Center, priority code." Henschel took the crumpled sheet and scanned the message under the dull light of the burning yard. "All available resources to be redirected to Vitebsk rail line. Smolensk Junction considered lost. Command anticipates temporary supply interruption of 7 days. Maintain traffic discipline." He let out a short, bitter laugh. Traffic discipline. The phrase felt absurd among the wreckage of steel and men. "Tell them it's not an interruption," he said flatly. "It's the end." The operator hesitated, then saluted and retreated into the swirling snow. That night, Henschel climbed to the roof of the depot's signal tower and gazed out across the rail yard. In every direction, the horizon pulsed faintly red, the glow of burning towns and wrecked trains. He could almost trace the front by the fires. Beyond those flames, the Soviets were advancing along every axis, toward Vitebsk, toward Minsk, toward the Dnieper crossings. A faint vibration reached his ears. For a fleeting moment, he thought it might be a train, but the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too heavy. He peered into the darkness through his field glasses. Then he saw it. Soviet Katyusha rockets streaking through the night sky, trailing fiery tails that illuminated the forest line. Seconds later, the barrage struck the far edge of the yard, detonating among the derelict cars. The explosions rolled through the night like thunder tearing the earth open. Henschel was thrown against the cold metal railing. He staggered to his feet, ears ringing, smoke filling his lungs. Below, the yard was an inferno again. Rails twisted like serpents, wagons aflame, fuel drums exploding one after another. He knew then that there would be no rebuilding. No new trains. The Eastern Front's lifeline had bled out. Somewhere in the chaos, he could still hear the rhythmic clack-clack of iron on iron. But it wasn't German steel anymore. It was the Soviets rolling eastward, carrying victory on their rails. Henschel turned from the burning yard, his eyes wet with smoke and shame. "God forgive us," he whispered. "We built the empire on steel, and now steel is all that's left." December 19th, 1943. Army Group Center Headquarters, Borisov, Belarus. The air inside the bunker was thick with smoke and frustration. The coal stove coughed fitfully, unable to cut through the bitter chill that seeped in from the frozen ground. Maps covered every wall, creased, stained, and riddled with pins that no longer reflected reality. The once orderly front had become a chaos of red arrows and shattered units. Field Marshal Ernst Busch sat at the long oak table, his gloved fingers drumming against the edge. Around him gathered his senior staff, General Jordan, the quartermaster, General Reinhardt of the 3rd Panzer Army, and a handful of weary liaison officers from the Luftwaffe and the Reichsbahn. The men's faces were pale and unshaven, their eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Outside, the wind howled over the steppe, rattling the bunker door like an omen. "Reports from Orsha are unreliable," Busch began, his voice taut. Colonel Henschel's last message indicated the junction was destroyed. "Without that hub, Smolensk is effectively isolated." Reinhardt leaned forward, his uniform smudged with dirt from his journey. "Then the 9th Army is finished. Foreman's men have no fuel, no ammunition. They can't even withdraw. Every division trapped east of the Dnieper is already starving." The field marshal's eyes hardened. "Berlin insists we hold. The Führer personally ordered no retreat. Every yard of ground must be defended. Jordan gave a hollow laugh. With what? Empty hands. The railways are gone, Herr Feldmarschall. You can order us to hold, but you can't order the trains to move. The Red Army has the lines. We're fighting ghosts now. Silence fell over the room. Only the crackle of the stove filled the void. Bush rose slowly, pacing the narrow floor. His boots scraped on the concrete. What about Luftwaffe resupply? A Luftwaffe major cleared his throat. Impossible. We've already lost 20 Ju-52s to Soviet fighters this week. Weather's closing in. Airfields near Vyazma are unusable. Even if we could fly, it's not enough to feed an army. The marshal stopped, resting his hand on the back of his chair. Then we have nothing left to maneuver with. Reinhardt spread a new map across the table. The red arrows pressed westward like bloodstains. We can still form a new defensive line along the Berezina if we withdraw now. But if we wait for Berlin's permission... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Bush stared at the map, tracing the rail lines with his finger. Each junction, Orsha, Vitebsk, Smolensk, once connected divisions, supplies, life itself. Now they were all red circles marked Verloren. Lost. He felt the weight of command pressing down, colder than the air outside. How do you fight a war when the very bones of your machine, the rails, have been severed? A communications officer burst into the room, panting. Herr Feldmarschall. Field telephone from Minsk, General Model on the line. Bush took the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. Model? The voice that came through was sharp, commanding as always. Bush, I'm taking over operations east of Minsk. The situation is untenable. The front will collapse unless we form mobile Kampfgruppen and abandon fixed positions. Bush exhaled, leaning against the wall. And Berlin? Berlin doesn't know yet, Model replied. And they won't until I decide to tell them. The line crackled, and then Model's tone lowered, almost weary. You feel it too, don't you, Ernst? The silence. The rails have gone quiet. That's when you know it's over. For a moment, the bunker fell utterly still. Everyone understood what that meant. The field marshal set the receiver down. His officers waited, watching. Finally, Bush spoke. Tell the staff to prepare contingency orders. No announcements yet. But start gathering transport for a westward movement, anything that still runs. We'll hold as long as we can. Jordan nodded grimly. And when the trains stop coming, sir? Bush looked toward the bunker door where snow whirled like smoke against the night. Then we march, he said quietly. Like Napoleon's men did before us. In the corner of the room, the coal stove sputtered out. The light dimmed and the cold reclaimed the air. January 3rd, 1944. Near Mogilev, Belarus. The snow came down in sheets, thick and relentless, muffling every sound except the crunch of boots and the clatter of frozen weapons. The remnants of the Ninth Army trudged westward through the skeletal forest. A column of men stretched for miles, ghosts in gray coats, hollow-eyed and frostbitten. The frost had turned their breath to steam and their uniforms to armor of ice. General Hans von Vormann rode at the front of the column in a half-frozen Kübelwagen, its engine wheezing like a dying animal. A Red Cross flag fluttered weakly from the antenna, though there was no fuel for the ambulances and no doctors left to tend the wounded. Every kilometer, another vehicle lay abandoned on the roadside, its tracks frozen into the snow, its contents ransacked. The convoy moved not by command now, but by instinct, the primal urge to survive. A junior lieutenant stumbled beside the general's car, cradling a rusted MG-34 across his chest. Sir, he called, his voice hoarse. The men haven't eaten in 2 days. The field kitchens are empty. Foreman didn't answer at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, a rutted track leading nowhere. Finally, he said quietly, the supply depot at Mogilev was destroyed. There's nothing between us and the Dnieper. The lieutenant's face twisted with despair. Then we're walking to our graves. Behind them, a horse collapsed in the snow, its ribs visible beneath the hide. The animal's rider drew his pistol and ended its suffering with a single echoing shot. The column didn't even slow. No one looked back anymore. The Eastern Front had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a wasteland. The railways, the arteries of the Reich, were gone. Trains that once thundered through the steppe carrying shells, fuel, and bread had vanished like ghosts. The men were now the freight, dragging themselves west on bleeding feet. Somewhere far to the east, beyond the curtain of snow, they could still hear the rumble of Soviet armor. The Red Army was no longer cautious. It was hungry too. devouring ground, rail, and cities in a single relentless push. The general's aide, Lieutenant Kramer, trudged alongside the vehicle, his face pale with fever. "Sir, intelligence reports say the Soviets have taken Vitebsk. They're moving toward the Berezina crossings." Foreman's heart sank. "Then our retreat path is closing." He looked back down the endless column of men, vehicles, and refugees, thousands of lives bound together by defeat. The snow began to thicken again, turning the soldiers into shapeless gray silhouettes. A sudden rumble echoed across the plain. The men froze, heads snapping toward the sound. For a moment they thought it was artillery, but no shells came. Instead, from the west, a faint rhythmic pounding emerged, metal on metal, deep and resonant. Trains. The men stirred, disbelief flickering in their eyes. Foreman's heart leapt. Could it be reinforcements? Supplies? Salvation? But as the sound grew clearer, hope turned to dread. The engines were too heavy, the rhythm too slow. Foreman lifted his binoculars. Through the falling snow, he saw it. A Soviet armored train, black and hulking, crawling along the captured line that once fed his army. Red stars gleamed faintly on its turrets. The men stood silently, watching their enemy ride their own rails. It was a cruel inversion. The empire of movement now reduced to a march of foot soldiers while the enemy rolled forward on steel. The general lowered his binoculars. Around him the soldiers stared into the distance, their faces slack with exhaustion and disbelief. One muttered, "They're using our tracks, sir." "Our tracks." Vormann said nothing. He simply whispered, "Not ours anymore." The march resumed. Step after step, hour after hour, through a world of white silence and ruin. No orders came from Berlin. No trains arrived. Only the slow, inevitable sound of the Red Army's advance behind them. By nightfall, the column reached a burned-out village. The men broke into the ruins, searching for anything edible. Frozen potatoes, old hay, even bark stripped from trees. Some lit fires from broken furniture. Others collapsed beside them, too weak to eat. Kramer approached the general with a tattered field report in hand. "Sir, we've lost contact with the Fourth Army. Their lines have gone dark." Foreman took the paper and let it drop into the snow. "Then it's over," he murmured. "The front doesn't exist anymore." He looked toward the west, where the rails vanished beneath the drifts, and realized what every German commander on the Eastern Front was beginning to understand. Defeat didn't arrive with a battle. It arrived in silence when the trains stopped coming. January 10, 1944, Minsk Supply Command Depot, Belarus. The depot had once been the beating heart of the German logistical network in the east. Now it was a graveyard of steel. Hundreds of railcars stood motionless in the snow, wheels frozen to the tracks, their contents looted or abandoned. Empty oil drums clattered in the wind like hollow bones. Major Friedrich Keitel of the Army Logistics Division walked the length of the ruined yard with a clipboard in hand, a ritual he no longer believed in. His breath formed clouds in the air, rising and vanishing just as quickly as the Empire's ambitions. Each train car told a story. One was filled with moldering sacks of flour, ripped open by scavengers. Another contained rusted tank parts, useless without fuel. A third held the decomposing bodies of horses that had once hauled the 2nd Panzer Division's supplies. His adjutant, Sergeant Braun, followed behind, wrapping his coat tighter. "Sir, should we start clearing the depot? The Soviets are less than a day away." Keitel didn't look up. "There's nothing left to clear. Everything that could move already has. Everything that can't will burn." From the north, a deep rumble rolled through the still air, artillery miles away but closing fast. The depot trembled faintly, shaking loose flakes of ice from the corrugated roofs. Keitel stared west down the rail line, the same direction his convoys had once run. He remembered the early days of Operation Barbarossa, when the trains never stopped. Thousands of wagons thundered east carrying victory. Soldiers sang as they leaned from open carriages, confident that the Reich's industrial might would never falter. Now, all that remained was silence. A communications officer ran from the command shed, panting, a telegram in hand. "Herr Mayor!" Message from Army Group Center headquarters. "They're requesting a status report on fuel reserves." Keitel's laugh was dry and joyless. "Fuel reserves? Tell them the tanks can drink snow, sir." He tore the paper from the man's hand and scribbled across it. "No supplies. Lines destroyed. Recommend immediate withdrawal." He thrust it back. "Transmit that." If the line still works, the officer hesitated. Sir, the line's dead. Cables were cut last night. Partisans. Of course they were. It always ended the same way. First the telegraph lines, then the bridges, then the rails themselves. The Red Army didn't just fight battles. It strangled the Wehrmacht's lifeblood, one artery at a time. A distant whistle echoed across the frozen plain. Everyone turned. Out beyond the snow, a single train emerged, black smoke curling into the sky. For a moment, hearts lifted. Perhaps a last resupply. Perhaps Rescue Keitel raised his binoculars. The engine's paint was chipped and scorched, but beneath the grime gleamed a red star. He lowered the glasses slowly. It's them, he whispered. They've taken the line. The Soviet armored train crept closer, its guns swiveling, the rhythmic chuff of its pistons like a drumbeat of inevitability. Keitel's men scrambled, shouting orders, scattering for cover. Leave the depot, he roared. Blow the remaining stores now! Explosions tore through the yard as demolition charges ignited. Crates burst apart. Fuel drums erupted into orange fireballs, and the last surviving German rolling stock was consumed in flames. The heat melted the snow, revealing the twisted rails beneath. Rails that had once stretched from Berlin to Smolensk like the arteries of a living beast. As the depot burned, Keitel stood at the edge of the tracks, his face illuminated by the inferno. Braun approached, coughing through the smoke. Orders, sir. Keitel turned toward the west, where a faint column of retreating soldiers wound through the snow. We follow them, he said quietly. The trains won't save us anymore. Behind them, the armored train began to fire, its guns flashing in the night. The air filled with the shriek of steel, the roar of collapsing timbers, the thunder of a dying empire, and beneath it all, the silence of the rails, the sound that told every German commander from Smolensk to Minsk that the Eastern Front was finished. January 17, 1944, near the Berezina River, west of Borisov. The morning fog hung low over the frozen marshes, swallowing the landscape in a pale, ghostly haze. A single rail line, half buried in snow, cut through the desolation like a scar. Along its edge stood the remnants of a German field column, vehicles half frozen, men half dead. The army that had once stormed across the continent now shuffled westward in silence. General Hans von Vormann climbed down from a snow-crusted truck, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Before him, an old freight engine stood puffing weakly, its once black hull streaked with rust. The crew had salvaged it from a wrecked yard days earlier, patched it with scrap metal and prayer. It was, impossibly, still alive. Lieutenant Kramer limped up beside him, one arm in a sling. Sir, we can fit maybe 200 men aboard. No more. Vormann nodded slowly, his breath clouding the air. Then that's all we take. The rest march, the lieutenant's voice cracked. Sir, that's not enough. We'll leave hundreds behind. The general looked down the line of soldiers. Gaunt faces, frost-bitten hands, men wrapped in rags instead of uniforms. He had no answer for them. War stopped giving us choices a long time ago, he said quietly. The engine gave a tortured groan as the firemen shoveled the last of the coal into the furnace. A dim orange glow flickered in the darkness. One last heartbeat of movement in a world gone still. Board the wounded first, Vormann ordered. Then the medics and any driver who can still steer. As the men clambered onto the cars, the ground began to tremble faintly. From the east came the distant rolling thunder of Soviet artillery. The Red Army was no longer days away. It was hours. A shell exploded far off across the river, sending a column of smoke into the gray sky. The soldiers flinched but didn't stop loading. They had become numb to fear. Kramer climbed aboard last, turning to face his commander. What about you, sir? Vormann's eyes followed the horizon, where the rail line curved westward, vanishing into the fog. He shook his head. I'll take the last train out, Lieutenant. Go. Sir, there won't be another train. I know. The engine whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the frozen fields. The locomotive lurched forward, wheels grinding against ice, dragging its freight of broken men into the west. Vormann watched until it disappeared into the mist. Then came silence. Only the wind moved, whispering through the pine trees. He turned to the few soldiers who remained, orderlies, drivers, and a handful of infantry clutching rifles with no ammunition. We'll follow the track as far as it takes us, he said. If we reach the Berezina, we cross. If we don't, he didn't finish. They understood. By dusk, the fog thickened into snow. Vormann trudged alongside the rails, each step sinking into the drifts. He ran his gloved hand over the cold steel, the same rails that had once carried his army into Russia's heart. Now they led only to ruin. He remembered the first time he'd stood beside these same tracks, 2 years earlier, when the trains arrived by the hundreds, each one humming with promise, each whistle a declaration of victory. Soldiers had cheered then. The rails had gleamed beneath the summer sun. Now as night fell, those rails were dull and broken. One line ended abruptly where Soviet demolition charges had torn the bridge apart. The steel curled downward into the frozen river like a severed vein. Vormann stopped at the edge and stared into the black ice below. Behind him, the last of his men stumbled forward, their silhouettes barely visible through the falling snow. The sound of distant gunfire rolled closer, like an approaching storm. The general took off his gloves and touched the frozen rail one last time. It was ice-cold, lifeless. He whispered almost to himself, "So this is how empires die, not with a roar, but with silence." In the distance, the faint echo of a train whistle rose and faded into the night. Whether it was memory, imagination, or some final trick of the wind, none of them could tell. But the men who heard it said later that, for a moment, they thought it was theirs, the last German train, still running west. Then the sound vanished, and the eastern front was swallowed by the snow.